I can tell you from my personal thing, like I came into research like kicking and screaming. I didn't want to do research. But when I look back on my career, I find like it's been so amazing, like so lucky. And definitely, if I'd been a prof in MIT or Harvard, this level of satisfaction would not have come anywhere near it. And the reason for that is the impact. And impact, I'm not measuring by paper or, the usual measures. I'm measuring it by like what you can do for students here.
Namaskar and welcome to another episode of the Professor Mahesh podcast, your resource to help you make informed career decisions. As we like to think, this is your future simplified. This podcast is brought to you by IITM Global, an initiative of the Office of Global Engagement at IIT Madras. IITM Global stands for everything that and the world needs to be benefiting from. Learn more about their activities through the link in the description below. Research is the reason nations grow. Innovation coupled with original thinking is the only true value creator in the society. Whichever countries embraced research front and center, those countries have grown leaps and bounds. This is what history of several thousand years has taught us. Today, India is at a cusp. Research in India in every discipline is on an uptick. A person who has been central to research as an enterprise in India has been part of many leadership teams and has herself contributed to research in India in a big way, is the guest for today's conversation, Professor Rama Govindaraj from ICTS in Bangalore. Thank you, Rama, for making the time. Let's start with your own research. Rain, clouds, it's a fascinating area. No country in the whole world is blessed with a phenomenon like we all in India know within a day or two when the monsoon is coming. Tell us a little bit about what got you fascinated in clouds and rain, and tell us a little bit about physics that drives that.
Okay, so there are a few other monsoons in the world, but there's nothing as big as the Indian monsoon. In fact, you may think about it as the biggest weather event in the year's calendar anywhere in the world. So it's really, really big. And as you know, there's 2 billion people in India and the neighborhood who basically depend on the monsoon. So for us, it's something much more than just a science event. It's actually a thing which keeps us alive. So that way it's very important. I did not become interested directly in the monsoon. I learned, even now I'm no expert on the monsoon. I learned bits and pieces about it by being with people who study the monsoon and people who study ocean. So I was very lucky to be in a project which involved many people from both India and America on the Bay of Bengal. So by being in many meetings with them and doing some work on the Bay of Bengal, I've learned bits and pieces about the monsoon. I've myself done like maybe 2 or 3 papers where we try to understand statistics and patterns in the monsoon itself. And we could come up with some interesting features. But most of the time, like as you know, I'm a fluid mechanics person. So like instead of doing statistics on the monsoon, which is not my forte, but what was interesting, I look at clouds. And clouds are a thing which, they are turbulent. There's water vapor in them, there's water droplets in clouds, and there's also aerosol particles. So like what makes a cloud, which cloud will rain, all these are very open questions. And more than that, for the Indian subcontinent, we need to worry about the following. In the next century, if temperature goes up and up on an average in the globe, what is going to happen to clouds? What is going to happen to rainfall? Now, clouds are the biggest uncertainty in any description of climate. So, like, whenever, they give climate predictions, we're going to warm up by this much or that much, the big error gaps come partly, mainly because of clouds. We don't know whether clouds are going to increase or decrease, whether they're going to rain more or less. And these all are a problem. Secondly, we don't know whether clouds are going to behave like an umbrella or are they going to behave like a blanket. By which I mean, like, suppose you have an umbrella to the sun, then you feel a bit cooler when you're shading yourself away from the sun. The other is when you're wearing a blanket, your body heat doesn't escape. So you feel warmer. So clouds do both of this. So they don't let earth cool because they reflect back, or they absorb and later reflect. They can do things like that. Or they can reflect the sun's rays and behave like an umbrella. So there are like some hand waving arguments about which cloud does what, but we actually don't know. So, like, to connect cloud to rain, this is the shape and this is the turbulence level in a cloud, and now it's going to rain. That's an open question, and this is an open question. How climate and cloud are going to respond to each other.
Yeah, I remember even in a high school, in a typical high school physics book, we say water evaporate, then clouds rain. It's like that little thing.
Yeah.
You just slot over the physics of how that process works. Tell us a little bit about what is happening inside a cloud. I think not many of us know.
Okay, so first of all, like, because of air pollution and things like that, we think of aerosol particles as bad. That's our way of thinking. However, like, aerosol particles are needed for rainfall. And usually, like, before humans came on this earth and did whatever they do, before that itself, there was aerosol particles in the atmosphere, which consisted in a big part on sea salt aerosol, with sea spray evaporating, and due to the winds, the salt particles go up and up, and then they descend slowly. And we had dust particles, of course, volcanic ash, all of those natural aerosols. And those aerosols are very, very needed for little raindrops to form, because you know that whenever something is super saturated, it will want to condense. But it will not condense unless there's a solid or liquid surface for it to condense on. Spontaneous supersaturation happens when, suppose saturation level is S, you need like much more, like 8 times S or something like that for supersaturate, for spontaneous nucleation of raindrops. Whereas usually in a cloud, it's never more than a 1 or 2%. So it's 1.05 instead of 8. So like you need aerosol particles. So first thing is, depending on the aerosol particles, and depending on the supersaturation, you're going to get water droplets forming. And this will happen at a certain height. Clouds won't form on the ground because the temperature keeps going down in the atmosphere as you go up. So you know that, clothes don't dry on a wet, cold day. You need this low temperature for the amount of water vapor that's there in the atmosphere to start condensing. This happens, and now you get lots and lots and lots of teeny tiny droplets. But then, like, how do they grow to a size of a raindrop? So this is one example I like to give. These are all 10 micron droplets. Every raindrop, let's say, is 1 millimeter or bigger. 1 million of them have to collide and coalesce.
Wow.
Only then you'll get one droplet. After every million coalescences. And every collision doesn't result in a coalition. So this is such a rare phenomenon. And so, like, rain is almost like magic. So to explain why such frequent collisions happen, we're still unsuccessful in explaining it fully, but we know that turbulence is part of the answer. We know that when clouds are turbulent, that these droplets meet each other more often.
When I'm in a plane and I'm descending down through the cloud cover, all the white stuff I see out of the window are little droplets of water.
Correct.
And they have to find a buddy first to coalesce once, and then those pair have to go find another pair. And this cascading process is all driven by just random motion?
Yes, it's driven by random motion, which is basically in a turbulent atmosphere.
How fascinating.
Yeah, it is just a random collision of 1 million buddies who make every raindrop.
Fascinating. I want to now find out your path to this problem. You started at IIT Delhi
Oh,
as a young woman studying mechanical engineering, if I'm not...
Chemical engineering.
Chemical engineering. Okay. Tell us about what was life like at IIT Delhi studying chemical engineering, and what got you to stay in India and do your research in India when I'm sure a bunch of your classmates were looking at opportunities globally.
okay, Mahesh, like last February, we had our 40th Ruby get-together of IT.
Yeah.
And very, very few are in India. Almost every one of my classmates is in America. A few are strewn here and there in Singapore or somewhere in Europe. Very few in India. I was somehow always clear that I want to live in India. And if I think back, I'm not very clear about the reasons, but it's just that I loved being here and I came back here. And I went only for a master's. So my PhD is also done in India. So that way I was very sure. What was the other part of your question?
How did you, after undergrad, where did you go for your master's, and what got you interested in the PhD problem that you worked on?
Okay, first of all, IIT was an amazing experience. I think before that I had zero confidence. And I certainly, if I studied in another college, I wouldn't have got anywhere near the courage to even pursue a middle level career, let alone think about science or something. I wouldn't have been able to do that. So IIT was like the first lucky break I've had. And it kind of formed what I could become, or, gave me possibilities. And then I went to Drexel University in Philadelphia for a master's. And that was just to see America. Because I knew that we could never afford to go to America, and I wanted to go. And in my family, up to that day, nobody had even gone near an airport, let alone sit inside a plane or something. So the first time I went to an airport, I went straight to America, that too alone. So that was just to see America, and I thought a good way is a 1.5 year master's where they're paying me a scholarship, and so that was my aim rather than moving to the West or studying in the West.
Then you came back to IISc to do your PhD?
No. I wanted to work in industry. I never wanted to do a PhD.
Okay.
So I like to say that I'm a failed corporate Zarina or whatever. Yeah, but it was because I was trapped in Bangalore by marriage.
Okay.
So then I had to look in a small diameter of places. So
But you found a diamond of a mentor in Professor Narasimha.
yeah, so for a few years in Bangalore, I tried my best to work in industry, work in different places. That didn't work. So finally, I came to do research. So I wasn't fond of research. I didn't want to do research. I used to tell everybody that if I can use Hindi, तुम लोग पर्चे छापते जाते हो, मैं कुछ कर दिखाऊंगी. This is what I used to say. But yeah, I changed my mind on that. And then because for the reason that there was nothing else I could do in Bangalore at that time. There were a few things happening, Infosys was coming out of a little house in Koramangala. I didn't see those things. I mean, I didn't have the imagination to see what Infosys would become or something. If I'd seen that, I'd have gone there.
Well, very few had the foresight to see what it could do back in those days.
Yeah.
Right?
In those days, it was thought that computers are bad for you. Many people used to think that.
Yeah, and even as late as 20 years ago, simulations were only as good as the experiments that were sort of shown on the graph accompanying the simulation, right?
Exactly.
It's only more recently that we take simulations for their own intrinsic value.
Exactly.
What was your PhD on? What did you work on for your PhD?
So I studied boundary layer stability, and that means if there's a solid body, imagine an aircraft wing, and there's flow past it. When the plane is flying, you can imagine the plane is standing and the flow is coming past it. Initially, near the near the leading edge of the wing, the flow is laminar, and at some point it goes through a transition to turbulence. Now, this is very important for aircraft industry, because if you can push the transition point even a little bit further, laminar is very cheap in terms of fuel. Turbulence is very expensive. So if you can push it a little bit, you will save billions of dollars. So that was the idea in those days, to understand what drives this flow on the wing to turbulence, and how can you stop it, or can you do designs to stop it. So at that time, I started looking at the stability of a laminar flow and see what keeps it stable, what makes it unstable. So, and in this thing, like I started, so this boundary layer, which I told you, it grows very slowly. So people will always assume that it's not growing. But then I showed that if you take that little growth into account, it actually changes the answer dramatically. In other words, it is what is called a singular perturbation. So that, like realizing that could make me write this very complicated Navier-Stokes solution. I could write an ordinary differential equation which described most of it. So to reasonable approximation, I could get it on my teeny tiny laptop of those days. Not laptop, sorry, desktop of those days, which, people like Boeing were running supercomputer things. In fact, Boeing bought my code.
Wow.
And I went to Seattle to show them how to run it.
Very
That was,
interesting.
yeah.
Very interesting. Tell us a little bit about your mentor for your PhD work.
Yeah.
What was that interaction like?
Okay, so Rodam Narasimha is the most amazing person. I think it was very, very lucky that I got to do my PhD with him. At that time, when I looked around in Bangalore and said, okay, like finally the best thing for me to do is a PhD. And at that time, I looked around and, like Rodam Narasimha was this singularity, like a singular perturbation. So he was like so much better than like many, many people around. So like the choice was very obvious. And initially, I thought he's a very harsh or sharp guy in my first couple of interactions, because he was very impatient when you did some slight mistake. But then I later found out that that's only a facade. Like he's actually very caring to all his students. He's very supportive. He wants you to come up with ideas, and he's happy to be contradicted. So it's not that he was scared of those things. I think too much not contradicting only would get him a bit angry, maybe. So he was that kind of person who was genuinely after the science. So for him, it didn't matter like whether the youngest person in the room is right and everybody else is wrong. He wanted the science to be right. So it was a complete pleasure. And as you know, he was a giant in the world of fluid mechanics.
Yep.
So like it was a very big boon to understand what important research or good research looks like.
Let's talk about that. What we are here in India today, the country, we say both the government and in some sense private industry is committed to creating new knowledge. There is an interest to invest in research, or increase the investment significantly in research. A young man or woman listening to this conversation and sort of on the fence on whether to take up a job right after a little bit of study or study more and do a little bit of research. What's the main value proposition? What's the main reason a driven young man or woman should today choose to do research in India?
Right. So, of course, it depends on your personal interest and what drives you. So, like if somebody is crazy about music or dance, I wouldn't tell them come and do research. So, I wouldn't give the same advice to everybody. And there are people who are made for the finance world, corporate world. We need people there also.
Sure.
So I'm not saying everybody should come to research or it's the best thing or anything. But to a person who's interested in this kind of thing, if they're interested in asking questions, if they're ready to put years into finding the answer, and if they like maths and they like physics, they like things like this, for such people I would surely advise that don't worry so much about the money right now, unless you have like serious family responsibility. Otherwise, like just take a look at this, like come and play with this world, do a summer project, do something, see if you like it. And I'm very sure that people who come for these summer projects and things like that, they start liking it. So it's just that they don't know what it is. And because research is such a small game in India, nobody's parent also knows what it is.
Yes.
So the parents also can't advise them to come here. So like it would be nice if we could expose students to it. One thing I think we can do as professors, I'm sorry, I'm diverging from your question. One thing we can do as people in institutes like this is to show them what research is.
Yes.
So for example, if we can bring 1,000 children or 1,000 young undergraduates from different parts of India, and especially like parts of India which are far from a big city or something like that, and we bring 1,000 of them here and put them here for 5 days, just show them every lab and show them the excitement, and some very good speakers will come and tell them, you will do this, you will do that. Those 1,000 students will go back and influence another 100 each of them. So this is the way, like we have to do it at scale. We can't do summer project for 5 children and say, oh, like we'll improve research in India. We have to think in terms of scale. This is my one.
That's a wonderful idea. The next best idea is people listening to 1,000 people listening to this conversation,
Right.
and saying, let me now go find an internship somewhere
Yeah.
close by.
Yeah.
I think practically every large university, every large institution in India has a summer research fellowship program. So I think it would be sort of nice to have research experience embedded into the undergrad curriculum. As part of their normal training. It's like you said very eloquently, ask questions and persevere till you find an answer. That's pretty much the start of
Yeah.
research, right? But what sort of questions, how would I know I'm asking a question that is right enough? Because you said I'm still 18, 19, 20, I may not know whether I'm pursuing the right question. Where would I gain that confidence?
Okay, so there, like students, I think teachers in schools should be given, instructions or whatever to keep their eye open for such questions. There are little children who ask very amazing questions, and if they don't know the answer, they should earmark that. And then they should encourage that child, and then slowly that child learns like what's a good question. So it's a process. Even we, like sometimes ask stupid questions.
Correct.
And we come up with stupid answers. But we ask enough questions that some of them are good, right?
Correct.
So that's how we also do. So it's not going to be that I can teach a person what the good questions are and how to ask them.
Correct.
But slowly, and like once you are exposed to some of these questions, you see the questions all around you.
So the key is to ask enough questions.
Yes.
That some of them are like, would reach the level of being a global challenge, and
Yeah,
that you are
yeah.
finding an answer.
Ask questions about everything. About everything. Like I remember once when my son was small, he came and asked me. He'd been taught that there is gases, liquids and solids. So he said when molecules come very, 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 very near each other, then what state of matter is that? Because he'd been told as molecules come closer, you get these things. So like
Interesting.
why stop at 3, right?
Right.
So
right.
things like that, you can ask questions about everything.
Sure.
So like I think every kid should be encouraged to ask why and why not. Things like that.
And in this day and age, with the amount of knowledge that is available in our devices, personal devices, finding a first cut answer is also not that difficult.
Correct.
Right? So, in this idea of becoming embedded in an internship program, in a research internship program, what should be the student's mindset when they are in a research internship program? What should be their expectation?
That's a hard question to answer.
Very often, I see students come in with the expectation of almost explicitly getting a letter of reference or getting
Right,
something
right,
out of it.
right.
What is a good expectation to have?
Right. So that is a problem, which is again like, we've converted everything to, some quantitative and
transaction
good.
of course.
Transaction. Yeah. So that is like a bit sad, it's true. But also there is, the fault is not only with students, the fault is also with all of us. Because when a student comes for 2 months, we are not ready to give them time or give them something.
Right.
Like we have some very standard little projects to give them and we say do that. So maybe the student gets disappointed
Right.
by their first exposure to research. So That's why I thought maybe a 3-day or some shorter model for a larger number of students. All of us may be willing to spend 3 days or part of 3 days, and then, like, that may work better than just scaling up the internships, because if you scale up the internships, you get more and more projects like that. So, like, and I don't blame us also. Like, we need our promotions, we need our papers. So, if we spend 2 months every summer only coaching some students and getting them interested in science, like, that can affect our career. So, like, we can't blame anybody anywhere in this. So, a good via media may be a fewer days and more students.
It's a very good idea. It's a very good value proposition. Let's now talk about PhD programs in India. Government stipend for PhD programs, whether it is through CSIR or the HTRA that IITs offer, has gone up significantly in the last decade, right? Why should somebody choose to do their PhD in India today versus, let's say even 10, 20 years ago? You were talking about how your Ruby reunion classmates were largely outside India. My own experience is today's IIT graduates are not like that, let's say in the last few years. So let's talk to why India today is a good place to do very high quality research.
Okay. So, first of all, I want to deviate a bit and answer about the stipend going up.
Yes.
Stipends have gone up. It's actually quite attractive, but most people don't know it.
Right.
Most people, like 99.9%, don't know it. Like, I used to live on IAC campus for decades. I used to come into the campus with autos. Almost every time I entered with the auto man would ask me, to study in a college like this, I'd have to pay a huge fees for my child. And I used to say, there's no fees, it's the opposite. Your child can study here and she or he will get paid.
Right.
And they don't know this. So, like, how many people know that you can get a PhD with a scholarship? That has to be first told to everybody in
Let's
India.
make that the first deliverable.
Yeah.
Students in India, 99.9 some percent get paid a stipend to do a PhD.
Right.
Even a master's in many
And this is the
institutions.
amount now. Like, it's actually a good amount compared to your first salary even.
Correct.
So that should be told to everybody.
Yes.
I don't think it's common knowledge
It
from
is
my
not.
experience.
It is absolutely not common
Yeah.
knowledge.
And second is, like, why choose India to do research? There's lots of reasons. I can tell you from my personal thing, like, I came into research like kicking and screaming. I didn't want to do research. But when I look back on my career, I find, like, it's been so amazing, like, so lucky. And definitely, if I'd been a prof in MIT or Harvard, this level of satisfaction would not have come anywhere near it. And the reason for that is the impact. And impact I'm not measuring by paper or, the usual measures. I'm measuring it by, like, what you can do for students here.
Right.
So, like, if you can show that you do good research,
Right.
then, like, that makes so much difference. So, like, sometimes in a movie theater, like, some students, like some young people will come and meet me and they'll say, like, I attended your talk or something like that. So that way, to the general public, we can make a bigger difference. Whereas in Harvard, like, if suppose I was a Harvard professor and I stopped writing papers also, somebody else would take over.
Right.
So I wouldn't be missed.
Right.
So here also I won't be missed, but it's a little less than that. So there's a satisfaction which goes beyond money or something else.
So I can talk to the fluid dynamics community. Being here in India, the body of work you've produced is absolutely world class. Very few people in India have done that. So I really want you to talk to what was your own process to produce truly world class research sitting in Indian labs and Indian academia here.
The one word answer is Rodam Narasimha, my advisor. So he actually had world class standards and he did, give us the thing for what standards are. And more than, just the value of the question, the value of the answer. So, like, how many times you have to keep on checking the thing, how you validate your code with great painstaking thing. You're not in a hurry. You just make sure everything is right so that when you say something, it is good. So, that kind of quality control, I think I learned just from him. It was as simple as that.
And then the process of doing good work with students, because the reason I come back to this question is, if you do good work, I have a feeling students will students still need to find you, but they would love to work with someone doing world-class research in an Indian university. Going somewhere else to do world-class research is always a second option for any one of us, right? So what was your own process with your own students? Identifying quality problems was a start, but what was your own process, and all the way to the publication stage? What was your own process to make sure this really was world class and found a world class venue at the end of the day?
Right. So first I would say I've been just very lucky in the kind of students I've got. Almost every one of my students is like a gem, and each of them is a different kind of gem, like not the exact same gem. So, like, that was a very good starting point for me. And I followed the Narasimha policy. I mean, Narasimha used to neglect us a lot, if I may say. But I didn't neglect them so much. But I had this concept that take them to the swimming pool and put them in the deep end. And if they're drowning, pull them up a bit and kick your leg or something like that. But don't don't go and teach every stroke or do the thing for them. So you show them, this is the class of problems and this is what I want you to solve. Typically, the problem I've asked them to solve, they've not solved in their PhD because it's like 10 PhDs.
Wow.
So for one guy, I said, let's look at hurricanes. And we ended up looking at one vortex instead of a hurricane, and a toy model for when a hurricane hits land. And that became an amazing PhD. And now, we still haven't solved the hurricane problem after decades, but we pared it down to a solvable problem. So, usually the problem I gave would be a big one, and in that, they could look for, things to do.
Let's switch gears and talk about from the student's perspective. While they are going through a process, while they are going through their own PhD, there are always phases. One of the reasons students don't come to do PhD is 4 years, 5 years. I don't know if I have it in me.
Right.
Where would you give yourself the solace that yes, we do have it in us to go that distance? How do we overcome that drowning feeling, so to say?
Right. So here I'll be preaching because I've not practiced what I preach.
Okay.
So I will say that when we take on students, we should give them first a small project and get them to write a small paper. We give them the big question, and then they're drowning for 3 years. That's not good. We should start them in small steps, publish a little bit so that they taste success.
That's a great suggestion. That should become part of a process in some way.
Yeah, we should give baby steps for them initially.
After all, we get this far with some baby steps somewhere?
Yeah. And we can give, we don't have to aim directly for Nature or something. We can aim for a respectable journal, never go below a certain standard, but we can give them one problem which will get into that. And a well-defined one so that they know how to walk and they do it. That way they won't get the drowning feeling if they're publishing from an early stage.
I think that will also bring in a group of people that are only afraid of the time span. They may have the abilities, but it's this long-term nature.
Yeah.
And the second aspect of a PhD is you invest 2.5 years, 3 years. There's no going back. It's like the wise thing to do is only walk forward into more unknownness, so to say, right? What you're suggesting will solve that as well in some way.
Yeah.
Right? A third aspect in most students' minds, and we will look at, is also they are all at the age where They are 22 to 25, 26. Many of their classmates may already be earning a little bit.
Yeah.
What should a student tell themselves when they are in these WhatsApp groups and conversations happening about people moving jobs, etc.?
Okay, so they have to face that. They have to face that temporarily or maybe permanently they're behind some of their classmates
Sure.
in terms of money making or whatever. So to some extent, like it's that. One more thing I'd like to say is that maybe like when you said there's no going back, I was thinking, like the people of today who are young people today, they're going to live on an average certainly more than 100 years. That's what is being said, that they're going to live very long. So if they're mistaken about their PhD, they're drowning after 3 years, there's no harm in leaving. It may not be for everybody, and then like when they come here, they may not like it. So we can't imagine that we have the best career in the world, although we think so. So this is the thing. So yeah.
Good. Let's switch topics. One of the downsides, one of the sort of the victories we've not yet achieved in India is gender balance in our research student population, and even worse at the academic faculty level. You yourself early on said you were sort of forced into research by marriage, and so you firsthand experienced the, I'll say, if you'll allow me, the constraints of being a woman in some way. Talk about that phase of your life, because I don't believe that phase of a woman's life has changed very much even today. So talk about that. What was your own mindset to sort of balance home and professional aspirations? Today, one can easily look at you and say you've done a good job of balancing that. The body of work speaks for it. So talk about that phase of your life, and I want to then go deeper into that conversation.
Okay. So I would say that there are different constraints in different people's lives. For me, the constraint was not that I have to run a home and go to office, because we both shared the responsibility, my husband and I, of running the home. For like more than a decade, when our children were young, we woke up at 4 o'clock every morning and did all the housework. After that, we woke up at 5 o'clock every morning. So it wasn't about housework or running the house. It was about geography. So like, if you're looking for a research job, imagine that you're tied to a pole here and your radius is 10 kilometers.
Right.
That geographical constraint is very bad for women, because typically they will get married to someone who's older, who's already well settled. So they are rooted, and now they're trapped by geography. So this is one problem. Maybe I don't know what the answer is, but maybe we need to let go of some of our, rigid, I don't know what to call it. I'd thought about it. Some strict inequalities. Like you have to write less than equal to for a woman. So like it shouldn't be that every woman who marries has to be less than her husband. But that is the constraint we are working under. So that may be something we need to change as a society, not as science or something.
Sure.
That like either of them could be older, either of them could be taller, either of them could be earning more. When we think in those terms, then it's easy for geography to not be a constraint. Then both of them can move around, look for jobs, things like that. So yeah, it's not an easy thing to solve, and certainly in my case it wasn't easy. It worked out with this inequality that I'm telling you about. But that may be something that is a problem.
You've looked at India up close, the Indian research and academic ecosystem up close for 30 plus years now. What are your views of systemic issues that are causing this gender imbalance, particularly in the research and the academic faculty level?
So the thing is that I've been relatively lucky, I would say, in spite of me being from a different generation, because I was in institutions and with people who didn't have biases like that. But that's not true everywhere. We know the story,
Sure,
right? Like,
sure.
You go a little bit away from these institutions and the bias is very blatant sometimes.
Correct.
So there are institutional biases, and one thing I've advocated for, and I don't know if it's feasible, is that interviews should be recorded. All interviews should be recorded, because what happens behind a closed door, like then to check whether it's fair or not, how do we do that?
Yeah.
And like I think having a woman in every interview committee will help. At least like, I mean, take it even the other way. Like suppose there's a male student who's coming from a very, very small place.
Right.
And if he's suddenly entering an interview room with 7 women professors, he'll feel a bit thrown, right?
Yes.
So it's the opposite for the women. And like it's also women coming from small places who can't do their best in the interview. And one more systemic thing, which is not the system itself doing it, but I've realized that, when students from who have, they are male and their friends are all boys, they will encourage their juniors who are boys to come to our interviews and they will coach them, they will train them. The girls are coming from places where they don't have such mentorship.
Because there is no critical mass of girl students that are to be able to do this.
And the senior boys are not helping them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So this, you're absolutely right. This sort of a mentorship ecosystem requires a critical mass, right? Only then you can find somebody.
Yeah.
If there are only 5 women PhD students, I may not be able to like find somebody with the right wavelength, right? So in some sense, when there is a critical mass of students, it is easier to find someone of your own stripe, of your own wavelength.
Yeah.
What sort of networks are available for women to find this mentorship? I think you hit the nail on the head when you said if there is somebody that can coach is like one aspect, but just be there.
Yeah.
What sort of networks do we now have in India, and what sort of networks would be even better to have?
So there are only informal networks where, like, suppose a girl student writes to me, I try to write back.
Okay.
In those days, they couldn't write to me so easily.
Right.
Whereas now they can see my email ID and write. So people do write and we do write back. So that way there's something there. But I think what would help more is people closer to their own age who say that this is possible. And another thing that I feel that we can try to do is to give information to parents.
Right.
See, like as a parent, I don't want to mess up my daughter's life.
Right.
And if I think a PhD is going to mess up her life, I won't let her do it. And so like they should be told that like she can do a PhD, don't worry about it.
I've had women PhD students in my research group who have withstood tremendous family pressure to continue in their PhD programs. They came in, when they were still unmarried. They kept asking the girl, when would you graduate? When would you graduate? What would be a message you will tell parents? And this goes multilingual. This podcast goes multilingual. I want this message particularly to go to a much broader audience as to why our girl students, our women students, among the best in our CBSE exams, they are by far the toppers in any CBSE exam in any given year. Why should they be encouraged to continue on for further studies?
I think like parents should first of all celebrate their daughter. They should allow her to do whatever she can best and celebrate just like they celebrate a boy. They shouldn't celebrate a girl less. So like this I'm telling from one particular example where a girl student came and told me that her parents were not happy when she published a paper in an amazing journal. Because they felt that she has now reduced the number of boys who published 2 papers in such journals. I mean, those are the only market for finding a groom for her. So this was like very sad. Like if a boy gets a good paper, the parents will celebrate.
Right.
They will say like, beta shabash, that kind of thing. It's not nice to like be mean when the girl has achieved something. So that is one thing which parents should celebrate their child, and then everything will become okay.
Very nice message. Talk to why more women PhD graduates across the country today. If you look at our PhD graduation population, we are at between 25 and 30% women in the graduating population in any given year. But the fraction of those that aspire to become faculty members is far smaller than among the male peers.
Yeah. I think the requirement of doing a postdoc, sometimes in a different country, those are all stumbling blocks for women. Because in many cases, the parents have been patient. They've said, do your PhD. But now they feel, oh, like if you get even older, then that's not healthy for your having your first child or things like that. So I think if people know more about statistics, like how many women have healthy children, like even at age 40 or something, if they know that it's not such a dangerous thing to do, then they may feel a little more calm about it. Otherwise, they do get worried, and I don't blame them since they don't know. So and those things have changed, because in our time it was indeed like probably more difficult. But now it's changed. So if everybody knows about the more modern statistics, that could be a piece of information that might help.
Also, is there something we can do from the institution side to sort of have more women come in? So in other words, could we have like an early mentorship program? Let's imagine an ICTS or an IIT Madras having an early mentorship program where you're not assuring them of a job, but you're telling them, go do a postdoc, come back, and we'll be very happy to consider you. I'm imagining what sort of early programs that we can create to encourage more women to stay in the line of becoming a faculty member.
So there are these women in science, women in physics, women in maths, those programs which ICTS runs every summer.
Okay.
So but again, it's not to scale. We can maximum do 50, 60 students.
Right.
Yeah. So whereas we should be doing 5,000, 6,000.
Right.
To make even a drop of change.
Right.
Yes.
50 years ago, our primary, middle and high schools were full of male teachers. Today, they're predominantly women teaching our children. When I go to private engineering colleges, in any like a tier 2 city or a rural area, I see a significant number of women teachers there. It's in the quote unquote elite academic institutions that we still have this problem. I think it's our collective responsibility to think about what could be some issues there that is helping this. Let's talk a little bit about something you did some time ago, and my memory may not be serving me right, but you created a program called Leelavati's Daughters.
I didn't create it.
Okay, let's talk about it.
Actually, Nilima Gupte here and Ram Ramaswamy, they created it. They made a book called Leelavati's Daughters.
Tell us about what your learnings was from that.
That wasn't a program. That was more like, I think 100 women were asked to write about their stories.
Right.
And a book was brought out.
Okay.
And I think that book was quite popular. So they then brought out a smaller version of it, more recent version of it. And I think that's gone into other versions, like some translated into some languages and things like that. So I think it has been a success.
I think having these stories showcased is in itself a victory in some way.
Yes.
Right? Let's come back to research as an enterprise in India. Right? We've talked of academic research, but there is an enterprise in the private industry that is now aspiring to do more research and development. What are the linkages you see that we need to build a little better between the private industry and the blue sky academic world in some way? What is your view of where that linkage could be stronger?
Yeah, we have to make that link very, very strong. It's not at all anywhere near strong. So one way is to have conferences and things where we invite both sides to give talks.
Yeah, when we go to a ComFlu or one of these conferences, there's hardly any industry.
Hardly any. And also the sessions are different.
Right.
Theory is different. That is different. But if we have, more one-on-one conversations and conferences, even one-day conference, like everybody speaks for 10 minutes, but let's see what comes out. So we at least know each other. We know what questions are bothering them. We can think about solutions for that, or they can tell us many things which didn't strike us as good questions.
Right. No, I think India is in a non-equilibrium growth phase for sure.
Yeah.
And it's a great place to be because there is room for every good idea today.
Yeah.
And there are resources that are falling behind every good idea out there. I think there is an aspiration to do more with the resources we already have in some way. This has been a fascinating conversation already. One of the things you kept coming back to along the way, and this may also have to do with the Leelavati's daughter's idea, is role models. You've had your share of role models that you've had both within India and outside India that you have looked up to. What are some ways by which a young student today can find their own path and a role model to sort of aspire to find?
I don't know, maybe we need to rethink how we orient our students. For example, I was thinking the other day that, there may be students who are good at law, good at politics, good at so many things, but they don't even know how it is. We learn something in civics about how our country is run or something.
Right.
But do we know what it is like to be a politician?
Right.
How do I know whether I want to be one or don't want to be one? So many people, I think we're not telling enough at a young enough age. So maybe they should be exposed to more such options and then they can take an educated guess.
Well, that's the reason I do this podcast, to help students gain the information to make their own career decisions. It's the next best thing to being immersed.
Right.
So, thank you so much. I think I've sort of picked up many, many different things along in this conversation. Rama, your closing thoughts on what you feel students in India can look up to 15, 20 years from now. What's this world going to look like and why should that be an exciting time for them?
Okay, so first of all, I'll talk about the challenges. For someone coming today to research in India, there are challenges that are unique to India. So why not you study them? You have to do something out of the box for that. For example, let's think about cleaning the air. Let's think about cleaning the cities. And let's think about innovative ways to deal with traffic, deal with things. And these may be unique to India, but we may have some geniuses coming up with these things. So, I would say, don't even look at all the problems that are presented to you by your advisor, but think out of the box. And in 15 years, who knows who will solve which problem.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I think the many dimensions that we got to cover in this hour-long conversation is really very enriching to me. Thank you, Rama. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mahesh, for the opportunity.
This has been another episode of the Professor Mahesh podcast, your resource to help you make informed career decisions. Until we meet again, be well, do good, and keep in touch. Goodbye.